Yeah.
Okay, we're live. So, hi everyone. I'm Keith Stone with the Center for Hellenic Studies. This is another Cosmos Society online open house, our last of the 2018 spring season. Our guests are Maša Ćulumović, Nancy Felson, and Laura Slatkin. For a quick intro to them, let me just say that Maša is a fellow in Pindaric Studies at the Center, and she's co-editing Pindar Commentary with Greg Naj. Nancy Felson is Professor Emerita of Classics at the University of Georgia. And Laura Slatkin teaches at NYU and Chicago and is a senior fellow at the Center. I encourage you all to go to the announcement page for this event and read their very, what do I want to say? There are biographies that are full of achievements and coded volumes and their interests, research interests, and all that. But for now, in the interest of time, I will just turn it over quickly to you there, the three of you at the Center. Maša, is there any intro that you would like to give to our session?
Just briefly, to thank you all for joining us. And as I mentioned, thank you for switching around your schedules. And it really is, I'm here sort of a mini version of Keith on this end of the meeting, because I'm really not the presenter, but I'm here I'm so happy that Laura and Nancy both agreed to come. And on a personal note, other than talking about Odyssey and the Underworld, which they will do the bulk of, I have been for a while now curious about their collaborations, because this is not the first one they've done, and I don't know if people are interested in this, but it's something I definitely want to ask them how it is, because not too many, not just classicists, but especially philologists, I think we don't co-publish enough. So just about the process, maybe at the end, I can get a question or two in there, because as I say, it doesn't happen very often. So I'm very happy that they're here at the Center, sharing it with me and the other fellows, and also with the rest of you around the world. So thank you for having us, really. And thank you, Nancy.
Thank you for joining us.
We have a lot of fun collaborating.
We do. and you could see from the complexity of our arrangement on what restaurant to eat at last night that we're not always on the same page initially, but we get there.
We work toward consensus.
We do. We get there eventually.
It seems like a perfectly democratic arrangement. Yeah, I got a glimpse of collaboration in terms of exchanging emails and text messages from one CCing everybody and both CCing everybody. There was a lot of collaboration already.
Yeah. Well, no, it's been very rewarding for us and very stimulating, I think, to have these collaborations. And we began, actually, maybe I'll say something about this at the start. We began with a collaborative essay in the Cambridge Companion to Homer. And this was probably 12 or 15 years ago, something like that. And we did a collaborative essay on gender in the Homeric poems. And then since then, we've done 3 or 4 other collaborative works on Homer, on Iliad and Odyssey, and also one on Aeschylus's Persians.
Oh yeah, that one.
Remember that?
Right.
And the impetus for this particular project now that we are hoping you'll help us with was an invitation to participate in a conference on the Odyssey in Greece.
On the island of Ithaki, one of the Homer conferences.
Yeah. Last summer.
Irresistible invitation.
And the topic was Underworld in Homeric poetry. And so because we've both been interested in problems of narrative, we thought that we would sort of investigate how those are, deployed in a way. I mean, not the problems, but the techniques in the Underworld passages, and that's how we centered on this particular topic of conversations in the Underworld.
We wanted to see how distinctive these exchanges were compared to upper world exchanges. That was our starting point.
And
Right.
yes, and so, and what we found was that in this, I mean, the Odyssey is famously rich in narrative possibilities and developments and so forth. And we did find that something, as we felt, was distinctive about the underworld passages, and not the same in both passages, but particularly the idea of how temporality, inflects the narrative unfolding of the Odyssey, and what the stakes are in the Odyssey of different kinds of temporalities meeting each other, as it were. And so in the first figures who are central in the sort of dynamics of the Odyssey, but who are no longer, as it were, active participants in the plot, like the mother of Odysseus, Anticlea, and so forth. And so our question in part was, what does it mean to have a perspective, as we get in the first Underworld scene, from people who are part of the plot up to a point, but not beyond it. And so the questions and the conversations and so on that take place between Odysseus, who is narrating his underworld sojourn to the Phaeacian, to his Phaeacian hosts, the kinds of questions that he asks and is asked by these residents of the underworld, by the shades. How does that, what kind of sense does that give us of different possibilities of how the Odyssey will proceed? Because we have another 13 books to go. So that's one element. And I don't know, do you want to tell us something about the Nemertea factor?
But I wanted to say that the vacuum in knowledge of some of the shades, and coupled with their curiosity sometimes about their own dear ones, is a like invitational to the poetry to entertain different options, different alternatives. So there's that. But also Tiresias marks what the shades are going to say once they have completed the ritual of drinking the blood of the sheep as Nemertes or Nemertea. And
True.
As true things, as infallible things. And we were interested in seeing whether that was really the case, or what kind of angle sometimes interfered with accuracy. So that was one of our questions as we were looking at 11 and 24.
So it's partly about the subjectivity of truth. I mean, what's truth to some of the interlocutors of Odysseus is not necessarily true to others, or doesn't necessarily align with the perspective of the narrative as a whole, for example. So this is, this was one of the things that we were.
Yeah. For example, Anticlea is very expansive in talking about Laertes' depression or his lack of energy, and talking about why she expired out of longing for Odysseus. So there's a very intense personal narrative told. All of these narratives are to second person addressees, and Odysseus is the addressee. And so that you have that kind of structure in the first Nicaea, which enables a kind of a very personal interchange, and sometimes requests such as Elpenor's in the beginning of the first Nicaea. Elpenor's who is the steersman. I think that Greg talks a lot about Elpenor, but I only saw a little bit, so I can't speak to that. But you might have heard, you might have a lot of information about that. But Elpenor craves burial, and he craves a burial site and mound with his oar. And so he asks Odysseus to be the agent of that.
Yeah, so he's the guy who was left behind on Circe's island. He falls off the roof and so on. And so, you know, in the, you know, one of these questions about temporality, you know, when Odysseus gets down there, who does he see first but the shade of Elpenor, of this young guy who had fallen off the roof, and whom they, and Odysseus says, you know, listen, how did you get here so fast? You know, you got here before we did. But that's because they sailed there, and Elpenor got there the normal way, as it were. You know, his shade is already there, and so, but so what he asks, as Nancy said, is for them to go back to Circe's island and bury him. Right? So that's an instruction about how the poem is going to proceed. So.
So he sets
Odysseus,
the plot in a sense.
So Odysseus agrees to go back. So Elpenor, in a sense, he sort of moves the plot to a point where they will, you know, return to Circe's island. But Elpenor can't see beyond that. So these figures in the first. So here we are in the middle of the poem, you know, in book 11, and so the poem both looks back a little bit, and if you take, as Nancy was saying, I mean, the vision, the perspective of Andoclea, Odysseus's mother, you know, who the poem says died out of longing for Odysseus. So here we are in a poem at a point where it's incomplete, and she, you know, his mother has died, as it were, because it's incomplete, because the poem is incomplete and he hasn't come home yet. And so she dies out of missing him, out of longing for him. But what she can tell him, he asks her, you know, what's going on at home? You know, what's going on back in Ithaca, in my household? And she paints this very positive, rosy picture of his, except for the, as Nancy says, the sadness of his father and so on, but she says, oh, your wife is fine and your child is fine and so forth. She doesn't know that the household has been overrun by suitors, because that was after her time. So she has a kind of, you know, she offers this, you know, picture of domestic, you know, tranquility and so on, whereas the external narrative has let the audience know that that's not the picture, and that's not the situation that has to be dealt with by Odysseus when he returns. So the way in which the underworld gives us these,
I'd say vignettes or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, that are not aligned with or don't get smoothed out. It can, in a way, because it's an elsewhere, it's a place where, through the eyes and the angle of vision of these specific deceased characters, it can provide vignettes that have their own integrity, in a sense, and don't need to be smoothed out.
But the question of how the Odyssey is going to proceed, what are going to be the, as it were, the sort of narrative moves of the poem, you know, in some way, the first underworld scene poses those as problems, you know, partly in that disparity between what the characters in the underworld know and what we're aware is going to be required for Odysseus to go. Then you have a figure like Agamemnon, whom Odysseus meets in the underworld, and Agamemnon says, well, you know what, don't go home and announce
Openly,
yourself. Go
right.
home in disguise, because you can't trust women. You know, your wife is at home and who knows what will happen. And then he tells the, you know, this story of the drama of, you know, his murder at the hands of his wife and so on. And so he uses that as a kind of model for Odysseus. But that's not going to happen either in our Odyssey. So the Odyssey is always giving us these possible alternatives, you know, these possible ways in which it could, and this is Nancy has done important work on this. But yeah, the ways in which it could go otherwise. And so it's always, you know, in a certain sense, it's always offering these narrative openings that it then reintegrates
or shuts down.
or rejects. And
I mean, really, as I wrote in this, I think it was 1994, regarding Penelope, it's not until book 23, line 205, I think, that Penelope's knees go slack and she recognizes and embraces Odysseus, for
do you know
sure.
what's in every line?
No, just
205. Okay, just checking.
Could be 305 because my memory sometimes switches numbers. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of that way in which the poem uses the characters' speculations about what Penelope will do to extend and the suspense and to keep things attenuated and to hold on to the interest of the audience and of readers like us is extraordinary. And of course, and Marilyn Arthur Katz's book also treats this, but and several essays that you've written on the Odyssey. But as long as we're plugging each other, that's part of our act.
Lines, Laura?
But the way in which the Agamemnon story functions has been treated by a lot of different scholars. And I think that in studying the speeches and seeing Odysseus meet and interact with Agamemnon in 11, and then seeing Agamemnon in book 24, which is a passage on your handout, assess the life of Odysseus and accentuate the role of Penelope in Odysseus's survival. There's a sort of authority that Agamemnon is able to offer as an Iliadic character and as and I call him an expert in infidelity. He's really well informed about that particular topic, which is a central topic, as we know from the beginning of the Odyssey, in the whole poem, because the Council of the Gods discusses at the beginning how Aegisthus didn't obey the warnings of the gods, and Athena, Zeus mentions, and Athena kind of invokes a curse on those who are like Aegisthus.
Yeah, she says, let anyone who behaves this way, you know, who's an aggressive suitor and seduces the wife and so on, perish in the same way as Aegisthus did. And it happens. It's fulfilled.
So we were very interested in, and it's been taking us a long period of study to fathom how reliable an assessor and evaluator Agamemnon is of the themes of the Odyssey, to what extent he is a meta figure, a figure who sort of stands outside and assesses once he has the information he gets from the suitor Amphimedon in book 24. But it's very interesting to us that Agamemnon figures so prominently in 11 and in 24, and that he never loses his Iliadic self, in a sense. Or is that, how would you put it, Laura? He always carries with him, because he is Agamemnon, the fact that he was Anaxandron Agamemnon, in the Lord of so many men, in the Iliad. And so that's kind of part of his authority, or his weakness is his history.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that interested us in connection with that, or one might say that was part of a sort of larger question that we were thinking about, which is how does the Odyssey manage to do what it does in both acknowledging the importance and the distinctiveness and so forth of the Iliad, and yet maintain its own authority side by side with the Iliad. In other words, the Odyssey represents itself as, even though we think that, from the standpoint of composition, these poems were contemporary. Maybe the Odyssey was a little bit later, but essentially they were contemporary, and yet the Odyssey represents itself as the aftermath. So how does, Monroe's Law. So how does the Odyssey manage to claim its own ethos and its own authority and so forth, and yet at the same time not entirely leave the Iliad behind? How could one, after all? So part of this is in the way Iliadic characters are present in the poem, in the underworld, and part of it is also also has to do with things that are not specifically in our passages, but about scenes of singing. For example, the bard on Scheria, who sings to the Phaeacians about the episodes from the Trojan War, and Odysseus validates his singing and so forth, and says, he offers a subject to the singer, a subject from the Trojan War, and the singer, Demodocus, sings about it. And Greg, of course, has written about this, in a definitive way. So this relationship of the two, of the Nostos epic, the epic of return, and the epic of, let's say, warrior hero glory, how they establish each other in a kind of complementary way is part of what we were interested in the underworld contribution to, so to speak.
And when you may have some questions, you can interrupt us.
Yeah, and please interrupt us. We're interrupting each other,
Yeah.
so you should interrupt
So
us.
one thing I was thinking about is, and this is sort of, it doesn't get into this paper fully, but is that there's a way in which Book 24 of the Odyssey reprises Book 24 of the Iliad, in the sense that you have the character Hermes. It's sort of a structural echoes that I hadn't noticed in all my years of teaching the Odyssey. And we haven't tested them so much yet, but I wanted to throw them out just as a point of discussion. But the presence of Hermes leading Priam to a sort of catabasis of sorts in Book 24 of the Iliad, and of his leading down the suitors in 24 of the Odyssey, then the way that Achilles approaches, and you do have this passage on your handout, the way in his 11 lines toward the beginning of Book 24, he approaches Agamemnon, not competitively, but with a kind of reciprocity, with a kind of overture, which, to be sure, isn't the equivalent of Priam's kissing the hands of Achilles when he approaches him in the Iliad, but there's a way in which what was the word we used? We got rid of tone, but it was the manner in which the two of them interact had more to do with Xenia than with Agon or with competition.
And one of the things, I mean, if I am right to say this, one of the things we wanted to suggest is that that's partly a kind of Odyssean ethos. That is, that the Odyssey, I mean, even though you have the parallel with Iliad 24, and yet that is such a precarious thing, but that the Odyssey really foregrounds ideas of reciprocity and exchange of xenia, guest friendship and so forth. And it has a kind of, partly the Odyssey is about how you, how to reintegrate the warrior hero. What happens when the war's over, and how does this,
what kind of society can you have?
And how is he brought into it? And in a sense, in the first Underworld scene, when you see these Iliadic figures like Achilles, after Agamemnon, Odysseus meets Achilles, and Achilles has this extraordinary speech in which he, when Odysseus says to him, "Oh, we
thought you were Makaristos.
Yeah, we thought
most
you were
blessed.
the most blessed," and so on and so forth. And here you're the king of the dead. And Achilles says, "Are you kidding me? I'd rather be alive as the
servant,
as the servant, of a day laborer, than king over all the dead." And so we want to, and other people, also have thought about this as a kind of enlargement that the Odyssey is offering of how things, how the values of survival and of return and reintegration and so forth can move from the Iliadic values of glory and
at all costs.
Sort of at the glory and sacrifice and so forth, so that the Odyssey, in a way, will acknowledge that, those Iliadic values, but it wants to move to something else, that is not conditioned by the battlefield, or not solely by the battlefield. So, and then Ajax, there's this terrible scene with Ajax, who won't speak to Odysseus because he's still holding that, it's like, you take that grudge to the grave. And Ajax can be angry after all those years. I didn't see that.
So can you flash it again?
Put that on again?
I'll read this here. It's a question from Bill. If Ajax can be angry after all those years without drinking the blood, couldn't Odysseus' mother have been more joyful, more joyous?
More joyous. Oh. You mean at seeing him? Is that what you mean, Bill? At seeing him? Huh.
I didn't understand.
Why is Anticlea not more joyous at seeing Odysseus? If Ajax,
emotions are so.
Each of these figures that Odysseus meets is idiosyncratic in a certain way. They're not depicted as a mold, but Ajax is the extreme example of a character who was locked in his own history and who essentially precludes any movement from the position he always held.
So he's sort of locked into the Iliad, or he's locked into a pre-return kind of
mentality.
Yeah, and yes, and so he can't, as it were, move into the Odyssey. He's sort of taken the
I read Ajax's silence more as contempt for the fancy speech making
of Odysseus.
Yeah,
Well,
that's a point too.
There's,
Yeah.
that is probably an element, but it's that, it in certain sense, it sort of keeps him in that Iliadic, one might say, sort of keeps him in an Iliadic condition, as it were, that he can't do what happens in the end, as Nancy was saying, with Achilles and Agamemnon, where they actually, manage.
So likewise, his mom is stuck
in that point, emotional.
Yes.
From when she left the world of
Yeah, that's a nice way to
Yes.
put it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's.
Yes.
We were struck by the fact that Anticlea, of all the characters except for Tiresias, has this moment where she talks about the rules of the decay
Broton.
the rules, the way things work for mortals when their spirit leaves their bones. And in that particular statement, which occurs right after he tries to embrace his mother 3 times and fails,
And he asks her why he can't.
why he can't embrace her. I mean, I think we haven't worked out the difference. I see it somewhat psychologically as the mother moved by her son's frustration to kind of enlarge her vision and give him something almost prophetic, almost seer-like about the condition of the dead. And I'm not sure, how you see that. But it is an aberration. It's an odd moment of expansion. And we were sort of looking at those moments when a subjective experience of a shade gets exceeded in a sense, or transcended. And we could stick with 11 and talking about it a little more, but I was also thinking in 24 that Agamemnon's typical way of talking about his own plight is self-pity. He's really always absorbed with how doomed he was and how bad his destiny was. But in a sense, when he hears Amphimedon recount his version of the Nostos, and he hears him, and you'd almost expect sympathy to be expressed because Amphimedon is his guest friend. But no, he focuses completely on Odysseus's victory, and he calls him Olbios, as you know. This is in passage, what?
Should be the last passage.
Is it 11? 12?
Passage 12.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Olbia. Laerta Pai.
Yeah. Oh, here it is.
That's in 192.
Yeah, okay, I was looking at the 7th line. Yeah, it's in passage 12. To me, when we're thinking about subjectivity, this is a moment where either Agamemnon rises a bit above his own particular narrative in order to take in and comment on the victory of Odysseus. That's kind of how I see it. It's like a moment of transcending his own private misery. And yet, at the end, he does tack on a condemnation of Clytemnestra and a prediction that she'll have a hateful song, in the last 4 lines, because she devised evil deeds. She'll have a stugere oide. So there's a big comment here. Wait,
Can you put that up again?
Yeah, Keith.
Let's see.
Yeah, thank you.
I will read it here. And just before you, I was going to say, this might be a good time if you want to pick any particular passage to go through in a more closer fashion. We've already started with the last one, so maybe there or wherever you would like. But okay, so the question is, from line 225 to 626 is not really necessary for the rest of the story. Is this 11 or 24? 11? I think Ellen's saying yes.
It's not in any of the passages.
Is it all?
No, I don't.
From around line 333 to 564, Odysseus meets with his army companions. From around 565 to 626, we have a catalog of heroes of the past. These passages offer contrasting descriptions with a plain, uncomplicated, unsophisticated passage between Tiresias and Odysseus at the beginning of the visit to the Underworld. After talking to Tiresias and his mother, Odysseus knows what is necessary for him to go on, in fact. So were these passages added to please the audience? So these passages offer a different way of looking at what happened after the war of Troy.
Well, one comment. I'm not sure I took it all in, but one comment is that there is this sort of sightseeing aspect of Odysseus's narrative to the Phaeacians. And when someone was commenting about Ajax and about Odysseus's, it was sort of suggestive of Odysseus's self-presentation to the Phaeacians as a really forgiving, not greedy, not hungry for the bow. He sort of he takes a position toward the Ajax story of distancing himself from it and presenting himself as a more generous, as I said, less competitive figure. He says, I hate that competition. So the two things I wanted to say is, one is that yes, there's a definite presentation by the poem of Odysseus as rhetorician, as sort of persuasive, and in a way Ajax's resistance to that, where he won't hear the story. He simply closes his ears to any possibility of being persuaded, or one might say duped, by Odysseus. So there's that aspect of it.
I mean,
but maybe we wanted something more about the other.
Well, no, I mean, I think it in the sense, this is partly about the kinds of questions we were asking, because one aspect of it is, one might say, is psychological, if you want to pursue that, and the business of, Ajax, Ajax's
kind of soul fixation.
Yeah, well, right, or his, let's say his, distrust of, as you put it very well, his, the fancy speech making of Odysseus. And so the other thing, for us though, was to think of how these various exchanges are narratively productive for the rest of the poem, and for the sense of the poem's own self-consciousness, so to speak, of where it's moving, and where it's moving away from the soi-disant, earlier epic. That is, how the epic that it is represented as earlier and prior and greater and so forth. And so, the poem that makes heroes is the Iliad, and so how it moves away from that and into a different set of values and a different ethos and so forth. So in that sense, we were interested in why, I mean, Odysseus, presumably, there were a lot of people down there, but the question is, why, what is the Odyssey doing with these, putting Odysseus in conversation with these specific figures? So, I mean, there are lots of them down there, from the Trojan War and so forth, but these specific, we're looking at the question.
Yeah.
I can read these. There are a couple of
yes
in the backlog. But before we get to questions, Could I ask, is there a particular favorite passage of yours that we could focus on a little as an example? You've been kind of touching.
Can we see
well.
that? Can we keep?
Oh, sure. So that very last question?
The very last question, which I think is a very good one.
But the one,
Isn't there carry forward of Ajax's character as it is presented in the embassy scene in Book 9 of the Iliad?
Yes. Yes.
Basically.
Yes. No, I think that's absolutely right. That is, so it's not about inconsistency of character. It's not that the characters in a way are changed. The question is really, what did they contribute to the evolving narrative of the Odyssey? You know, so the Odyssey, I mean, what is, you know, the challenge to the Odyssey, you know, one might say, is how to establish itself as a poem that is comparable to the Iliad, but it doesn't just recapitulate what's in the Iliad. You know, it's going somewhere else and looking at other kinds of you know, problems, one might say, and other kinds of human situations from the ones that are those, you know, exigent, you know, terrible existential, you know, demanding problems that the Iliadic heroes find themselves, you know, contending with, Achilles and other people too. And the Odyssey is looking at something else, which is reaches another level. Okay. Which is another level.
yay, Laura. Yeah, one thing I wanted to add to that is the notion that in Agamemnon's response to Achilles' 11 lines in Book 24, his provision of a very detailed account of essentially the heroization of Achilles at the funeral and through the funeral games as a sort of epilion, as a sort of a piece that it's almost like a gift of song to Achilles, which adds a dimension to the Naikos and of the Iliad between them. I mean, there was reconciliation in the Iliad eventually, and Achilles in Book 23 of the Iliad is rather accommodating to Agamemnon. But this goes way beyond accommodation. It's really an active gift of glory to a figure who in Book 11 has said he doesn't care about that, but we in the audience see his ambivalence and that he does care about Time for his father, honor for his father and for his son. And in 11, Odysseus was rather hyperbolic in praising Neoptolemus to his father, even saying that he was almost as good as Nestor in the Agora, which is pretty unusual. But in 24, this rapport between the shades of Achilles and Agamemnon speaks directly to the quarrel of the Iliad and kind of puts its own stamp, as Laura was saying, on, let's say, enmity beyond death. So in death, the enmity is, the sting is, it's transformed into this xenia between them. And it's interesting to me that the word xenos is used, guest friendship or guest friend, in the second set of speeches in 24 for Amphimedon's relationship to Agamemnon.
Is it on here?
Let's look and see. No, we just included the part of Amphimedon's speech where he assumed that
Oh yes, there is on page 8. For he was his guest when he Xenos
Oh, okay, you got it.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. The last line of
Marsha, we
24.
have to take you
Thank
everywhere
you.
with us.
Please do.
Okay, line 104, he was his guest when he lived at home. But it's mentioned 3 times in the text, and so we're feeling as if that's kind of reinforcing the observation that that Agamemnon is an offerer of Xenia, first to Achilles, whom he also calls Ulpios, and then to the absent Odysseus. So so there's a sense in which Agamemnon, from being this tight, subjective, locked in his own story figure, expands in 24 and becomes a kind of voice for the poem, especially when he calls for a song of praise for Penelope and a song of hatred song for his Clytemnestra. Yes, Bill.
Okay, I think, okay, you were just talking about the difference between Agamemnon in the first visit and in 24.
Yes.
So keep in mind, there's 2 different writers or singers in this case, right? In the Underworld, it's Odysseus representing Agamemnon is in a pity party. And in the last book, it's Homer representing Agamemnon.
Right.
So whatever is the truth, we need to keep in mind that, of course, Odysseus is going to make himself look good, as you pointed out earlier, in his version of things. So I maybe it's nice to think it's some sort of personal growth in Hades, but maybe the reality is Odysseus painted himself in one way versus the way Homer actually saw it.
Right. I agree with what you're saying. It's interesting to me, I'm still struggling with this, the way that 24 builds on Odysseus's he's a secondary narrator, his story is embedded, it's colored by the speech situation, which is, he wants to get Pompeii, he wants to get passage home from the Phaeacians, not to mention gifts. And a lot has been written on that topic. So I think the pragmatic aspect of Odysseus's adventures, or apologoi, told to the Phaeacians, is to me a very fundamental thing, that it's aimed towards getting something. It's a muthos kerdaleos in Greek. It's a speech that, a long one, 9 through 12, books 9 through 12, that has a pragmatic goal in mind. On the one hand. Yeah, go ahead. We have a little bit of friction about this, but not, well, this speaks to collaboration. The friction, whenever it occurs, leads us to something new. I feel like that's the case. It's good friction.
Yeah, I was not going to disagree with this, but just to say, that we were also interested in, and I we pointed to this a little bit earlier, in the difference between, granted, I think what Bill is saying and what Nancy has also been thinking about in Odysseus's, the sort of goals that he has in his presentation of the underworld, of his, stay in the underworld, but also at the same time, what's the difference between the way things look in the middle of the story and what they look like at the end of the story? And that's the kind of thing that we also were oriented to. That is, by the time the exchange takes place in 24, as it were, the Nostos story is over.
Almost, except for the reconciliation with the relatives.
Yes.
Which
But
has to
the
happen.
Nostos story is over in the sense that he is back and he has been, returned to his household and has sort of cleaned up the household and so forth. There's a lot to say about that, of course, but he has been recognized and all the mutual recognitions, except for the one with his father. have taken place. And in a way, we were saying this to each other the other day, that it's interesting to think about Laertes. Why isn't Laertes in the underworld? You would think that by this stage of the game, the underworld would have included him. And yet the poem actually has Odysseus meet him
In the upper world.
in the upper world. And this is partly about, undoubtedly, sort of the, triumphant,
3 generations.
representation of patriarchy, which has its glorious moment in the battle with the relatives and so forth, where Laertes rejoices to see his son and his grandson
Vie over Arete.
Their skill in the balance over it. But it is also, there's also something about the way that the Odyssey complicates, temporality. That is, in some sense, the logic of things would be that Laertes is down there too, with Anticlea and so forth.
So he's been on the verge of death for many, many years.
But the Odyssey is going to wait until Odysseus actually meets him, and this is a thing that also speaks to the, as it were, success of Penelope in the way that she has suspended time, because with her weaving of the shroud, this is a fantastic thing, because for that to succeed as a ruse, in staving off the suitors, not only did the suitors not have to discover that it is a ruse, that she's weaving and unweaving, but Laertes has to not die. Right?
He doesn't have a shroud.
Right. So we were saying that she's sort of like.
May I ask something? I'm sorry to switch topic, but I just wondered if I could just pick up on something you were saying earlier, Nancy. You referred to Agamemnon's speech to Achilles as the gift of song, and it sort of gives him that accomplishment. And I was looking at passage 11. This is one of the suitors, I think. And he does a little summation of that that return scene and the contest. And I wondered if you would see that almost as a gift of song, a reconciliation. And this is someone who has broken the Xenia.
This is Amphimedon.
Yeah, Amphimedon. I see his speech as an exoneration speech, or as a self-exoneration speech, speaking on behalf of the 108 suitors. He is giving a recapitulation of the Nostos, of that part of the Odyssey, but the driving force of it is, and it's evident in his emphasis as a teller of tales, is to minimize the offensiveness and the criminality, if you will, of the suitors, and maximize the manipulation of the royal family, all in cahoots with one another. So it's almost like Agamemnon's way of looking at his victimization, but it's kind of turns the Nostos into, oh, look what you did to the suitors. Oh, you cut us off. We weren't so bad. We thought Odysseus would never come home, and Penelope encouraged us. And then when he came home, she was just doing his bidding to set up the contest. So that one particular feature, and why we included it in bold on this 11, is that it's not consonant with the primary narrator's version that we've been very familiar with as external readers. I mean, there's been a lot of ink spilled on when Penelope knew what she knew.
But we know that she didn't, in fact, collaborate with Odysseus in any explicit way.
Right. We see her getting the idea of setting up the contest, we're not mind readers of Penelope. Characters do try to be, but
But like he says that
Yeah.
Odysseus ordered his wife. Yeah.
Yeah.
but that's a false statement that he at least, yeah, that's a false
But
statement.
these are all, these are ways in which the Odyssey could be told, but our Odyssey is not going to tell it this way.
Right,
But
it
the
wants us-
Odyssey is full of these,
false starts or false
these
or
sort of
alternate versions.
right, these sort of alternative, versions that it then brackets or excludes. As in the suggestion that I mean, there are a number of places, but the for example, the suggestion when Telemachus nearly strings the bow, now why is that in there? But the epic cycle contains a narrative about a different ending to the Odyssey, in which Odysseus goes off and marries the queen of the Thesprotians and has a child, and the child, then eventually comes back and kills Odysseus, not knowing that Odysseus is his father, and so forth. And so all of these possible alternative endings, and possible, but the Odyssey wants to remind us, it could have gone a different way, but this is the way that actually it did go. Right?
Could these in fact be alternative tellings, not just possibilities in the mind, but actual stories that existed?
Yes, actual narrative trajectories that were followed elsewhere. But the Odyssey, it takes account of them, but it refuses them.
It says, I'm aware of these. The Odyssey says, I'm aware of all these other ways of telling the story. But
that's not this story. That's not the, the ultimate telling. Doesn't doesn't accept those. And I think so. If Amphimedon and his family want to tell the story, let them tell it this way. But that's not the way the Odyssey is going to tell
But
it.
it's really quite remarkable that the loser, you could call Amphimedon and the suitors losers, I would think.
They're losers in every sense.
In every sense. And the losers get to have a voice. And that's quite extraordinary, given that in most situations, you get this sort of obliteration, or you get the winners telling the story. You don't give the narrative floor to the losers. And I think it's extraordinary to hear Amphimedon, and then to hear Agamemnon inside the text essentially refuse pity to the loser. I mean, that's extraordinary, because we've been led by that Xenia to think, oh, he's gonna be sympathetic. And I had this idea, it hasn't borne fruition yet, but that the poem gives Agamemnon an as-if experience of witnessing Aegisthus. What story would Aegisthus tell about his life story? He actually is never given a chance to have his story told by first-person narrative, and yet the suitors, everybody. In my Penelope book, I was sort of unduly generous to the suitors as sort of overgrown teenagers. I think I had a teenage son at the time, and I was a little lenient on the suitors, and of course the poem is hard on them, and they are in the category that is set up in book 1 of with Aegisthus as the kind of prime example. They're not quite as bad as Aegisthus, right? Or yes, maybe they are.
Oh yeah,
They are bad.
I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
Well,
But-
they're not as bad because there is no killing.
That's what I
In
mean.
other words, they don't. Yeah, there isn't actually a murder.
There isn't a murder.
But there could have been. I
But
mean,
they're in the
planned
same category. They're
They
in this
planned the
category.
murder of. They planned the murder
Of
Telemachus.
Telemachus, right.
They just don't have the opportunity.
Right.
If I may, it occurs to me that the the suitor's doom is sort of sealed by Athena in book 1, talking to Telemachus. But this very harsh treatment, as opposed to, say, exile, seems sort of out of sync with Bronze Age punishment of criminals. I mean, you could kill your brother, or kill your uncle, and your punishment was to be exiled. And I guess the community was sparse enough and big enough that somebody could just go off and live somewhere else happily. But Athena is saying they're bad people and need to be killed right there at the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a couple of ways of thinking about that. I think it's a good point. And one of the ways, and Greg actually has written about this. I mean, insofar as there is still a kind of regard for kleos, for glory, for the legacy, that immortalizes the hero, in that sense, getting home does not represent, achieving kleos, achieving glory, and the moment, the thing that can offer this to Odysseus, so that he has not only return, but also not only nostos, but also kleos, is that battlefield, as it were, scene, which is, happens to be in the dining room, but it's a battlefield scene in which he kills the suitors, and it's a sort of Iliadic Aristeia,
Yeah.
His moment of, your moment in the spotlight on the battlefield, but it's greater than any Iliadic Aristeia because it's one guy against 108, opponents. So it's the Odyssey's way, in a sense, of giving him both. I mean, the Odyssey is all about both and, and having it both ways. And Odysseus gets it both ways. He gets to have his return and he gets to have class. So that's one way of thinking about it. I mean, agreed that it's, the brutality and the hanging of the maids is a thing that,
Yeah.
that people
That's on
have.
Telemachus's.
That's on his shoulders. Yes, it's true. But that, that these elements of brutality.
His father didn't tell him to torture.
No. Very true.
Yeah.
So
I once taught the Odyssey to judges in a sort of continuing ed program at the law school at UGA, and they were very hard on legally on Odysseus in the cave of the Cyclops. They thought he would probably be charged with breaking and entering. But they were also attuned to the kind of justice issues and whether the punishment way exceeded the crime.
it is a good question.
And it's a good question. I
We
think
actually
that,
have an article about that.
oh yeah, we do. Sissus and Nostos.
Yeah, about the very end, about the business of the families of the murdered, of the slaughtered suitors, objecting. And I think there is a question, and I think what you raise is very important because, there is a way of thinking about the Odyssey as something that, intimates, polis values, sort of developing, values of the polis community, not just of the, Mycenaean kingship kind of thing. And as such, it is a very, it is very vexed, that business of the killing of the suitors and what's going to happen with that. And it does, as you say, it takes Athena. It's both Athena's setup, as you say in book 1, but it's also Athena at the very end, saying, okay, this is, now we're going to, now we're going to sort of end things with this.
Amicably, really. She
Yes.
wants a truce.
She wants a truce, and
there's a
that's the
sense
Athena of that's the Athena who is the, in Athenian, as it were, mythology, she's the dissolver of factions. I mean, she's the resolver, I should say, of factions and so forth. And that's the way she's presented at the very end of the Odyssey. But you do have, a lot of blood on the floor and a lot of bodies and so forth.
And she was actually active in the slaughter of the suitors.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She's in there.
Right in there. So there's something vexed, and it also is unresolved, I think, about the morality of killing off the wooers of your wife. There's that. And also it recalls the charge of the suitors. I think it's Antinous' father. I think it's Eupeithes, but I'm not sure. The charge that Odysseus is responsible for the loss of his crew, his hetairai. Although the poem has ascribed that loss to their own atasphalia in eating the cattle of the sun. And there are several places where that is endorsed. And so that in an effort, there's an exoneration to some of Odysseus.
Sure.
But there is this fact, which a suitor picks up on, that Odysseus came home alone. And what happened, he's the king, and there's a sense in which his responsibility for having people to be a king over is called into question.
In a way, this is really the challenge of the Odyssey because of our, poem, because the traditions about Odysseus are so vexed. He really does not look good, in a lot of them. And in the fact that, partly the quarrel over the arms,
Arms of Achilles.
competition over the arms of Achilles, which is, where the fix is in, and so he gets them, and partly in the fact that he comes home alone. He's supposed to be, the leader, and he comes home without any of his men and so forth. And, and this is the thing that the Odyssey is so, and the fact that, his, just as you were saying before about his sort of fancy speechifying and so forth, the fact that in the Iliad, and in Book 9, to think of that too, he's a sort of tool of Agamemnon, and he misrepresents, or he sort of is misleading about what Agamemnon has said.
He leaves out
he
the
repeats
buses.
it. Yeah,
He leaves out the last two lines
when he repeats it to Achilles. Yeah.
that Agamemnon said, I'm basiluteros, I'm more kingly, and I'm elder.
So that,
And therefore he should yield to me. And he uses a verb of yielding, which is interesting.
which is right. And Odysseus, who is, and he's the one who in the Iliad is interested in his own, in his own survival. But in the Iliad, you're not supposed to be interested in your own survival. That's not what the Iliad is, that's not what the Iliad values. Achilles and Ajax have their, they take up positions at each end of the line of ships, and those are the most vulnerable positions. Odysseus's ships are right in the middle of the, which is the most protected position. And there are various points in the Iliad in which Odysseus, just sort of avoids being
At risk.
And so forth. So this is the figure that the Odyssey has to recuperate. And it does it, one of the ways in which it does it is that it makes just those qualities that the Iliad is suspicious about, or those qualities that are not values in the Iliad. The Odyssey makes those just the things that he needs to survive and get home. Like fast talking and privileging survival over, over self-sacrifice and so forth. So the Odyssey actually makes those sort of questionable, questionable qualities into the things that make the poem work. And the
But in a
things that
sense,
will-
it's a thelpsis, it's an enchantment of the reader, of us, to be kind of taken in at the primary level of narration by this presentation of the hero as admirable, and so that there's a sense in which you can read the Odyssey against the grain and sort of take a negative position on Odysseus, but it's doing a lot to woo you not to do that, to kind of gloss over and undermine any attempt to reduce Odysseus.
No, I think that's right.
And I mean, there's this one aspect of it that Odysseus is lying, and his disguises are not domestic values. I mean, lying in the bedroom and lying within the oikos, once the oikos is restored to being somewhat harmonious, are kind of questionable traits. And the Odyssey has to convince us that between Odysseus and Penelope, and Odysseus, even in his father in 24, I mean, it's almost uncanny that he lies to Laertes unnecessarily in 24. But somehow,
In order to then reveal himself.
But then, it's almost like the part of the poem's ruse is to sort of present this complicated figure in a way that is palatable or admirable or something like that.
I so hate to interrupt the flow of your insights, but we have to thank you for them and wrap up. Our hour has become an hour and a quarter. And I know you're about to go to lunch there.
Okay.
We're like the Odyssey going on beyond its own end. It's at the end of book 23, and it goes on to book 24.
Yeah.
So we're like that. But thank you all.
Thank you for your comments.
Yeah, terrific.
It was
Actually.
such fun talking to you all.
Very helpful.
I hope we answered, or we at least tackled some of the questions that came up.
But those are very, very helpful comments, both about Ajax and about the end of the poem. I think we will be thinking about those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I love how